You were never my choice, Charlotte. After 7 years of building a home, raising his children, and protecting everything he owned, her husband leaned close and whispered the words that shattered her completely. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She picked up her travel case, placed her wedding ring on the table, and walked out of Crawford Estate forever. And that was the moment everyone realized the quiet wife they'd ignored for 7 years was the only reason any of them still had a home. Before we go further, if stories about women who rise after being broken speak to your heart, please subscribe to this channel and follow Charlotte's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ballroom, below the marriage above. The music drifted up through the floorboards of Crawford Estate like smoke, soft, sweet, completely indifferent to the fact that a woman's life was falling apart 2 floors above it. Downstairs, the ballroom was everything Nathaniel Crawford had always wanted the world to see. Candlelight catching crystal glasses. The finest families of Virginia gathered in their silks and their polished boots, laughing with the kind of laughter that costs money. The kind of evening that made a man feel important. That made a man feel chosen. Charlotte Morgan Crawford stood at the window of their bedroom and watched the carriages lined up in the drive below, and she thought not for the first time that she understood why her husband loved evenings like this. He needed to be seen. He always had. She had spent 7 years making sure he looked like a man worth seeing. Her travel case sat on the bed behind her. Small, brown leather worn at the corners. The same case she'd carried into this house the morning she became his wife. She hadn't packed much. A few dresses. Her father's medical journal. The letters her mother had written her before she passed. The things that had always been hers before she became his. She heard the door open behind her. She didn't turn around. Charlotte? His voice was the same voice she had fallen in love with. Low, careful. The voice of a man who chose his words the way other men chose horses, for appearance, for effect, for what they would carry him toward. The Hargroves are asking for you downstairs, he said. I won't be going downstairs tonight, Nathaniel. A pause. Victoria is here. She turned around then, not because the name surprised her. She had known about Victoria Langley for 3 months. She had found the letters, not snooping, not searching, but simply reaching for a ledger she needed from the desk drawer he'd forgotten to lock. The letters were tied with a blue ribbon, 14 of them, each one beginning with "My darling." Charlotte had read exactly 2 sentences of the first one before she'd placed them back exactly as she'd found them. She had spent 3 months deciding what to do with what she knew. Tonight, apparently, Nathaniel had decided for her. I know she's here, Charlotte said. You invited her. He crossed his arms. He was still handsome, she would never deny that. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that could convince a woman she was the only person in a room. They had convinced her once. Charlotte, I need to talk to you. I know. This isn't how I wanted. Nathaniel. Her voice was quiet, not weak. Quiet the way a lake is quiet before a storm. Say what you came up here to say. He looked at the travel case on the bed. Something moved across his face. She watched it carefully, that flicker she had learned to read over 7 years of marriage. He hadn't expected the case. He'd come up here thinking he would find her crying or angry or desperate. He'd come up expecting to manage her. The case changed his calculations. You were never my choice, Charlotte. He said it the way a man says something he's been holding for a long time. Half confession, half cruelty. His voice dropped to a whisper, like lowering the volume might soften the impact of the words themselves. It didn't. My father arranged this marriage. The estate needed stability. It needed an heir. You were the right woman at the right time. Charlotte looked at him. She did not cry. She had already cried. 3 months ago, alone in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, she had sat at the table and wept until there was nothing left to wept. She had given that grief its proper time. She had honored it. And then she had folded it away, not buried, not denied, simply finished with it. She was done crying over a man who had never truly opened his eyes long enough to see her. The right woman at the right time. she repeated softly. I didn't mean. No, don't soften it now. She stepped away from the window. Say it the way you mean it. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. My father believed you would be a good match, good family, sensible, capable. He was right about that. You have been... He paused, searching for the word. You have been exactly what this estate needed. But not what you needed. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. And Victoria, Charlotte said. Something changed in his face at that name. Something softened. That was the cruelest part, watching her husband's face soften for another woman while he stood in the bedroom they had shared for 7 years. Victoria and I have an understanding. I imagine you do. Charlotte, do you love her? The question landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. He flinched. Actually, flinched. As though the directness of it was something he hadn't prepared for. Yes, he said finally. I believe I do. Charlotte nodded. She turned to the bed and picked up her travel case. Then there's nothing more to say. He took a step forward. Charlotte, wait. We need to discuss this properly. There are arrangements to be made. The estate will manage. She said it with such certainty that he stopped walking. It always has. She moved toward the door. Where will you go? He asked. He said it the way a man asks about a misplaced object. Where is it? What should I do with it? Not where will you go, and are you safe, but simply the logistics of Charlotte's disappearance. She paused at the door. She looked back at him one final time. Somewhere, I am not someone's obligation, she said. And then she walked down the back stairs of Crawford Estate, past the servants who pretended not to see her, past the kitchen where she had spent 1,000 mornings planning the meals that fed this family, past the door to the study where she had quietly fixed the financial records that would have ruined them 3 years ago, and she walked out into the Virginia night. The music from the ballroom followed her all the way to the drive. Then it faded, and she kept walking. What everyone thought they saw. By morning, everyone in the county knew. The story traveled the way stories always travel, imperfectly, hungrily shaped by whoever was telling it. The version most people settled on was simple. Charlotte Crawford had left her husband after discovering his affection for Victoria Langley. Poor woman. Tragic, really. But then, hadn't she always seemed a bit plain for Nathaniel? A bit too quiet. Nathaniel Crawford was a man built for something grander. Everyone had always known that. Mrs. Hargrove said over tea that she felt simply terrible for Charlotte, though she also noted that a woman who doesn't know how to make herself indispensable to her husband could hardly be surprised when he looked elsewhere. Mr. Whitfield at the grain exchange said it was unfortunate business, but these things happened. Victoria Langley said nothing publicly. She was very good at saying nothing publicly. And Nathaniel gave a brief explanation to his closest acquaintances about a mutual decision, a respectful parting, and quickly moved the conversation toward the upcoming harvest and whether the road south would hold through the fall rains. Nobody asked about Charlotte's side of things. Nobody thought to, because Charlotte in 7 years of marriage had been very carefully invisible. She had managed the household with such quiet efficiency that people experienced the results without ever noticing the labor. The meals were always right. The house was always in order. The workers were always paid. The records were always balanced. The problems were always solved before they became crises. When a woman does her work that well, people assume the work does itself. They never ask who's been doing it. The cottage on Miller's Road. Charlotte's family had left her a small property 8 miles from Crawford Estate. Her father's people had farmed that land, and when they were gone, the cottage had been maintained barely by a caretaker who mostly kept chickens there and didn't ask questions. She arrived on foot just before dawn. Her boots were wet. Her hair was loose from its pins. She carried her travel case in one hand and her father's medical journal tucked under her arm because she had gone back for it at the last moment and she was glad she had. She stood in the doorway of the cottage for a long moment. It smelled of dust and old wood and the faint memory of her mother's cooking. Charlotte set her case down. She lit the lamp. She sat down at the small kitchen table, 4 legs scarred surface, 2 chairs, and she opened her father's journal to the first page. To Charlotte, he had written in his careful physician's hand, "You will always know more than they expect you to. Trust it." She read that sentence 3 times. Then she stood up, rolled up her sleeves, and began to make the cottage livable. She did not grieve. She did not collapse. She made a list of what needed doing, and she began at the top. Because Charlotte had learned something in her father's medical practice, watching him treat the sick and the dying and the simply frightened, that the best thing to do in the immediate aftermath of devastation is to focus on the next small, concrete, necessary thing. Fix the window latch, sweep the floor, find wood for the fire. One thing at a time. When you are broken, you rebuild from the floor up. You don't start with the ceiling. She worked until the sun came up. Then she went outside and looked at the land around the cottage, overgrown, neglected, but good soil underneath. She could feel it in the way her boots sank when she stepped off the path. Her father had taught her that too. The land remembers what it can do even when nobody's been asking it to. A farmer named Ezra Calloway lived half a mile down the road. He had brought his youngest daughter to Charlotte twice in the past year, when the estate physician was unavailable, once for a fever, once for a badly set break in the girl's wrist that Charlotte had reset properly and wrapped with materials she'd carried in her own bag. She would start there. What a woman carries! Charlotte had always known she had a gift for medicine. Her father had recognized it when she was 7 years old, following him on his rounds, asking questions that made him pause and think before answering. He had taught her everything he knew, not because it was conventional, not because it was expected, but because he was a man who believed that knowledge belonged to whoever was willing to earn it. She had earned it quietly. She had never talked about it at Crawford Estate. Nathaniel's world had very specific ideas about what ladies knew and didn't know, what they did and didn't do. She had helped people in small ways carefully without drawing attention. She had kept her father's journal close and her mouth closed. But now she didn't have to be careful about what she knew. Ezra Calloway opened his door that morning and stared at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Crawford," he said carefully, because the county was small and news traveled fast, and even Ezra Calloway, who cared nothing about the gossip of fine families, could see the travel case and draw his own conclusions. "Miss Morgan," Charlotte said, "if you don't mind." He considered that. Then he nodded once, with the particular respect of a man who understood that some lines didn't need to be explained. "What can I do for you, Miss Morgan?" "Your Northfield," Charlotte said. "I walked past it on the way here. The drainage is wrong. You're going to lose half that crop when the fall rains come if you don't redirect the runoff." Ezra stared at her. "I can show you," she said. "And if you'll let me set up a small clinic in my cottage, nothing grand, just a place where people can come when they need help, I'd consider your assistance with the field a fair trade." He was quiet for a moment. "My Agnes," he said finally. Her wrist healed perfect. Physician over in Millhaven told her it would always pain her. It don't. "Good," Charlotte said. "Then we understand each other." They shook hands at his kitchen door. It was the first honest partnership Charlotte had entered into in 7 years. The estate without her. She learned what was happening at Crawford Estate from Ezra's wife, Margaret, who heard it from the washwoman who came twice a week from the estate. The harvest numbers were down. 3 tenant families had given notice. One of the groundsmen, old Thomas, who had worked the Crawford land for 20 years, had walked off the job after a dispute over wages that had gone unpaid for 2 months. "People are saying it's the weather," Margaret told her, refilling Charlotte's teacup without being asked, which Charlotte had already come to love about Margaret Calloway. "It's not the weather," Charlotte said. Margaret looked at her. "The drainage on the east fields has been wrong for 4 years, Charlotte said. "I brought it to Nathaniel's attention in the spring of 1813. He was busy. I put it in writing and left it on his desk. I'm not certain he ever read it." She kept her voice neutral, not bitter, simply factual. Margaret was quiet for a moment. And the workers. Charlotte wrapped both hands around her teacup. Thomas Greer is the best groundsman in the county. He's kept those fields functional through droughts and floods and 2 early frosts. Nathaniel always meant to pay him fairly. He simply had other things on his mind. Like Miss Langley. The name didn't hurt the way it once had. Charlotte found with some surprise that she was past that particular pain. What she felt now was something different. Something closer to clarity. Among other things, she said. Margaret leaned forward across the small table. Charlotte. She used the first name deliberately warmly, the way women do when they've decided to be honest with each other. Do you regret leaving? Charlotte looked down at her tea. She thought about the ballroom music, the wedding ring on the table, the travel case, the dark walk to the cottage through wet grass. I regret, she said slowly, that I waited 7 years to do it. The doctor people came to trust. Word spread the way it always spreads in small communities, not through announcements or proclamations, but through whispers and witnessed results. Ezra Calloway's drainage ditch worked. His north field came through the fall rains intact when 3 neighboring farms lost significant portions of their crops. His daughter Agnes, 12 years old, sharp-eyed and serious in the way of children who've been through pain, told everyone at the church meeting that Miss Morgan had fixed what the real doctor had said couldn't be fixed. Charlotte had not advertised herself as a physician. She never used that word. She simply opened her cottage door at reasonable hours and helped whoever came through it using her father's methods and her own careful observation and the supplies she traded for, and occasionally purchased, with what small income she began to earn. A woman came with a child running a dangerous fever. An elderly man came with a wound that had begun to turn bad. A young wife came who was terrified about her first pregnancy and had no one to ask. Charlotte helped each of them. She did not charge more than people could pay, and when they could not pay at all, she accepted eggs and firewood, and once memorably, a very opinionated rooster named George, who turned out to be an excellent early alarm. The land around her cottage improved steadily. She bartered medical knowledge for labor and lumber and seed. She fixed the roof in October with the help of 3 men from Ezra's extended family. She planted winter crops along the south side of the cottage where the soil drained well. She was tired at the end of every day. She was more alive than she had been in years. Nathaniel's blind spots. She might have gone her entire life without knowing the full extent of what had been hidden from Nathaniel, except that Thomas Greer came to her cottage one cold November morning with his youngest boy, who had a rattling cough that needed treatment, and while Charlotte worked, Thomas talked. He was not a man who talked easily. He was 60 years old, built like a man who'd spent every one of those years outdoors, and he had the particular dignity of someone who had been wronged and not yet decided what to do about the wronging. Mr. Crawford don't know the half of what was going wrong on those fields, Thomas said, watching Charlotte tend to his boy with the careful focus he'd spent 20 years applying to soil and weather, and the complicated needs of living things. Begging your pardon, ma'am. Miss Morgan. No pardon needed, Thomas. Charlotte kept her eyes on the boy. Tell me. 3 years back, when the south wall of the grain barn was failing, it was you who ordered the reinforcements. Did Mr. Crawford not tell you he signed the work order, but it was you who'd written it out and left it with his papers? Charlotte's hands didn't still. I knew the wall was failing. I arranged for the estimate. I left it for him to sign. He signed it, Thomas said. But when I thanked him for it later, he looked at me like he'd forgotten about it entirely, like he hadn't even read what he signed. A pause. Begging your pardon again? You don't need to keep begging my pardon, Thomas. What else? He was quiet for a moment. Then, the records from the summer of 1814, the drought year. There were families on that estate who shouldn't have made it through 4 tenant families, who were months behind and ought by rights to have been given notice. They weren't. I always assumed Mr. Crawford had decided to carry them. He didn't know about it, Charlotte said simply. Thomas looked at her. I paid the outstanding amounts from the household accounts, she said. I made sure the records reflected it as an estate expense. Nathaniel never asked. It seemed unnecessary to bring it up. Those families still farm Crawford land, Thomas said slowly. I know. He was silent for a long moment. His son was breathing easier already, and the boy had fallen into the shallow doze of a child whose fever is finally breaking. You've been holding that place together, Thomas said. Haven't you, Miss Morgan? It wasn't really a question. Charlotte placed a cool cloth on the boy's forehead. I was married to it for 7 years, she said. I did what needed doing. And he never... Thomas. She looked up. He never thought to ask. That's not entirely his fault. Men in his position have very rarely been asked to notice the things that hold their world together. They simply expect the world to hold. Thomas Greer looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man reassembling his understanding of something he thought he'd known. What are you going to do? He said finally. Charlotte smiled small, genuine, the smile of a woman who has stopped waiting for someone else to answer that question for her. What I've always done, she said. What needs doing? The ring. On the table. Sometimes late at night when the cottage was quiet and the fire had burned down to coals, Charlotte would think about the moment she had placed her wedding ring on the table. She had been wearing that ring for 7 years. She could still feel the absence of it on her finger, a phantom weight, like a word you've said so many times it stops having meaning, but the shape of it still lives in your mouth. She did not regret taking it off, but she thought about what the ring had represented. Not what Nathaniel had meant when he put it on her finger. She understood now with the clarity that only distance provides, that he had put it on her finger because his father told him to, and because she had seemed like a sensible choice, and because he had been 24 years old and more interested in being seen as a responsible man than in actually becoming one. She thought about what she had meant. She had meant it. She had stood in that parlor and promised to love and to honor and to hold, and she had been 22 years old and completely genuinely sincere. She had looked at Nathaniel Crawford and believed not because she was foolish, but because she was hopeful. Because hope is not the same thing as foolishness. No matter how often people conflate the two, she had believed that she could build something real with him. And she had built something real, just not with him. She had built it around him and beneath him and through the gaps in his attention and the silences in his understanding. She had built it the way you build a foundation, invisibly, unglamorously in the dark. He had lived in the house. He had never seen the foundation. Victoria comes to town. She met Victoria Langley exactly once during that winter. It was at the general store in town early January, when the frost had come hard and most people were moving quickly and speaking briefly because the cold made everything feel urgent. Charlotte was there for medical supplies. Victoria was there. Charlotte suspected simply to be seen. She was a beautiful woman. She carried beauty the way some people carry weapons, not aggressively, but with a constant awareness of its power. Their eyes met across the store. Victoria looked for one unguarded moment, like she might try to disappear behind a barrel of salt pork. Then, she straightened her spine and crossed the floor. "Mrs. Crawford," she said. "Miss Morgan," Charlotte said pleasantly, exactly the way she had said it to Ezra Calloway in his doorway. "It's Miss Morgan now." Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. "Of course. I want you to know I never intended—" "Miss Langley?" Charlotte kept her voice gentle. She had thought about this conversation, or a version of it, for months. Not with anger. Just with the desire to be honest. "You don't need to explain yourself to me. What happened between you and Nathaniel is between you and Nathaniel. My marriage was its own thing, with its own failings, and very few of those failings belong to you." Victoria blinked. "But I will tell you this," Charlotte said still gently. As one woman speaking to another, he is a man who doesn't see what's right in front of him until it's gone. That is, it can be a painful trait to love. Victoria said nothing. "I hope you know what you're choosing," Charlotte said. And I hope sincerely that he chooses you back in the way you deserve." She picked up her supplies. She walked out of the store. She didn't look back. Outside in the cold January air, she stood for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of it. The strangeness of that conversation, the sadness of it, the odd, unexpected relief of saying exactly what she had meant, and nothing more and nothing less. Then she walked back to her cottage. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and for the first time in a very long time, the work was entirely, completely, undeniably her own. She had spent 7 years waiting to be chosen. She had finally chosen herself. But what no one at Crawford Estate knew yet, not Nathaniel, not Victoria, not the fine families who had watched her walk out into the night, was that the thing Charlotte had built in those 7 years of careful invisible labor was not just a home. It was a power. And the moment she walked away from it, they were all going to feel exactly how much of it had belonged to her. The frost came hard that January, and with it came the kind of quiet that settles over a place when everything underneath it is slowly falling apart. Charlotte felt it differently now. 8 miles away in her cottage on Miller's Road, she could feel the trembling of Crawford Estate, the way you feel a loose tooth with your tongue, not painful yet, but wrong. Persistently, undeniably wrong. She didn't go looking for information. She didn't have to. Information came to her the way everything in a small county eventually comes to the person who listens best and judges least. People talked to Charlotte because she never used what they told her as a weapon. They had learned that about her over 7 years of watching her manage Crawford Estate with quiet, invisible precision. They were learning it again now in her cottage where nobody left feeling smaller than when they arrived. Margaret Calloway came on a Thursday morning with a basket of cornbread and a look on her face that Charlotte had learned to read. "Sit down, Margaret," Charlotte said without looking up from the bandage she was rewrapping on old Henry Pierce's hand. "Whatever it is, it'll wait 2 minutes." Henry Pierce, who was 73 and had the patience of a man who'd been through enough not to rush anything, nodded pleasantly at Margaret and said nothing. Margaret sat. She folded her hands on the table. She waited exactly 2 minutes. When Henry left, pulling his coat on and tucking a small jar of salve into his pocket, Margaret said, "3 more tenant families are leaving Crawford Land." Charlotte set down her supplies. "Which 3? The Dunnings, the Harpers, and old Silas Webb." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Silas Webb had farmed the northwest quarter of Crawford Land for 18 years. He was the kind of farmer other farmers watched, the kind who understood soil and rotation and the long patience of growing things in a way that couldn't be taught, only lived. Losing Silas Webb wasn't just losing a tenant, it was losing institutional knowledge that had taken decades to accumulate. "What reason did they give?" she asked. "Unpaid wages from the summer harvest, 3 months behind." Margaret paused. "And Silas said, and I'm telling you this exactly as he told Ezra, he said nobody at that estate knows what they're doing anymore. That the instructions coming from the main house don't make sense. That he planted the south field the way he was told, and the way he was told was wrong, and when he pointed that out, the manager told him to mind his own business." Charlotte pressed her lips together. The south field. She had written a detailed note about the south field soil composition 2 years ago. She had left it in the management records. If the new manager had simply read it, but then that assumed someone had told the new manager where the management records were. That assumed someone had bothered to explain the system she had built over years quietly, without ever being asked to explain it, because no one had ever thought to ask. "Who is managing the estate now?" she asked. "A man named Alderton. Came from Richmond. Nathaniel hired him in November." Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. "They say he has very impressive credentials." "I'm sure he does," Charlotte said. She stood and went to the window. Outside, Ezra's 2 eldest boys were mending a fence line, working steadily and without complaint, the way men work when they respect the land they're tending. She watched them for a moment. "Charlotte," Margaret said quietly, People are starting to talk, not gossip, real concern. There are families in this county whose livelihoods depend on Crawford land running right. If it doesn't, I know, Charlotte said. Is there anything you can do? Charlotte turned from the window. There was something in her expression that Margaret would later describe to Ezra as the look of a woman who has made a decision she was already halfway to making, but needed one more push to complete. There's plenty I can do, Charlotte said. The question is whether doing it is my responsibility anymore. Margaret didn't answer immediately, because it was a real question, not a rhetorical one, and it deserved a real consideration. I reckon, Margaret said finally, in the slow, careful way of someone choosing their words with respect for the person who has to live inside them. That responsibility and obligation aren't always the same thing. You don't owe that estate anything, but the families on it, Silas Webb and the Harpers and the Dunnings, they didn't choose their landlord. Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. No, she said, they didn't. She picked up her father's journal from the shelf where she kept it within arm's reach always. She sat down at the table and she opened it and she began to write. Not to Nathaniel, not about the estate. She wrote a careful, precise summary of everything she knew about the soil conditions, the drainage issues, the rotation schedules, the contractual terms of the tenant agreements, and the specific nature of what was going wrong and why. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to write medical observations, without emotion, without self-interest, with the sole and absolute focus on what was true and what would help. When she finished, she set down her pen. Ezra knows Thomas Greer, she said. He does. Margaret confirmed. Would he be willing to see that Thomas gets this? She folded the pages carefully. Ezra would walk it to Thomas himself if you asked him, Margaret said. Good, Charlotte said, because Thomas Greer understands what that land needs better than any manager from Richmond. And if Nathaniel Crawford has one grain of sense left in him, he'll listen. She paused. But I won't be the one delivering it, she said. I won't go back to that estate as a supplicant asking to be useful. If the information helps them, it helps them. That's enough. Margaret took the folded pages with both hands, the way you take something you understand to be more significant than its weight suggests. You're a good woman, Charlotte Morgan, she said. Charlotte almost smiled. I'm a practical woman, she said. There's a difference. But her eyes, for just a moment, were something softer than practical. They were the eyes of a woman who had spent 7 years loving something that never quite looked back, and who was only now slowly learning what it felt like to love something that did. The cottage, the land, the people who came to her door. These things looked back. And that she was discovering changed everything. The pages reached Thomas Greer on a Friday. By Saturday morning, Thomas had read them twice. By Sunday, he had walked the south field himself and confirmed every single thing Charlotte had written. He stood in that field in the January cold and felt the ground under his boots and thought about 18 years of watching this land, 18 years of understanding its patterns and its needs. And he thought about the quiet woman who had apparently been paying closer attention than anyone had given her credit for. He went to find Alderton. He found him in the estate office, reviewing numbers at the large desk that had once been Nathaniel's grandfather's. Alderton was a compact man, with efficient movements and the particular confidence of someone who has never had to question whether he belonged in a room. Mr. Alderton, Thomas said. He held his hat in his hands, not from deference, but from habit. I need to speak with you about the South Field. Alderton looked up. I believe we've discussed the South Field Greer. With respect, sir, we haven't. We discussed planting schedules. We haven't discussed why the South Field is going to fail by March if the drainage isn't corrected. Alderton set down his pen. The South Field was planted according to my specifications. Your specifications, Thomas said carefully, don't account for the clay layer 6 inches under the topsoil on the eastern third. When the spring thaw comes, that water's got nowhere to go. Everything planted in that section will drown. A beat of silence. And how? Alderton said with the careful tone of a man deciding whether to be insulted. Do you know about this clay layer? Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out Charlotte's pages. He set them on the desk. "These were prepared by someone who spent 7 years studying this land," he said. "I'd suggest reading them." Alderton looked at the pages. Then he looked at Thomas. "Are these from Mrs. Crawford?" "Miss Morgan." Thomas said exactly the way Charlotte had said it, exactly the way she'd taught him, without knowing she'd taught him. "It's Miss Morgan now." Alderton picked up the pages. Thomas watched his face as he read, watched the confidence shift, watched the professional certainty, the Richmond credentials, the impressive references come up against the specific, granular, inarguable knowledge of someone who had walked this land in every season for 7 years. You could see the moment he understood what he was reading. It was small, just a slight slackening around the eyes, a barely perceptible adjustment of his shoulders. "This is quite detailed," Alderton said finally. "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "It is." Another silence. "She wrote this from memory," Alderton said. "Miss Morgan has an exceptional memory," Thomas said. "Among other things." Alderton set the pages down with the particular care of a man recalibrating. "I'll need to review the rest of these with the planting records." "I thought you might," Thomas said. He put his hat back on. "I can walk you through anything you're unclear on. I've been here 18 years. Between the two of us, we might manage to do right by what's left of the season." He paused at the door. "Mr. Alderton, those 3 families thinking about leaving the Webbs and the Dunnings and the Harpers. If you want them to stay, the wages need to be settled before week's end. Once a man of Silas Webb's quality makes up his mind to go, he don't tend to unmake it." Alderton looked at him. "That would be Mr. Crawford's decision." "Then," Thomas said quietly, "someone needs to tell Mr. Crawford." He left Alderton sitting with Charlotte's pages and walked back out into the January cold, and he felt for the first time in months something like cautious hope. Not because Alderton was a bad man, he wasn't. He was simply a man who'd arrived at a place without understanding what it had cost other people to build it. That, Thomas reflected, was a particular kind of blindness. It wasn't cruelty, it was just not seeing. And in his experience, not seeing was often more damaging than cruelty, because at least cruelty knew what it was doing. The wages were settled by Wednesday. The Webbs stayed. The Dunnings stayed. The Harpers, after a long conversation with Silas Webb about the nature of loyalty to land and the difficulty of starting over at their age, stayed too. Alderton implemented 3 of Charlotte's drainage recommendations before the month was out. When the spring thaw came, the south field held. The eastern third, where the clay layer sat 6 inches down, drained properly for the first time in years because someone had finally dug the redirect channels where Charlotte's notes had indicated they should go. Nathaniel Crawford rode the south field on a morning in late February and looked at the healthy drainage lines cutting through the thawing ground and thought, not for the first time that winter, but for the first time with any real force, about his wife, his former wife, about the woman he had said he never chose. He had said it as a truth. He had delivered it thinking it was kindness of a sort, the kind of brutal honesty a man offers when he has decided that his own feelings are more important than the feelings of the person in front of him. He had thought, better she knows. Better she understands why the marriage was always limited. He had not thought about what 7 years of limitation costs a person. He hadn't thought about what it costs a person to give their full intelligence and attention and care to something that never looks back and calls it love. He hadn't thought about a lot of things. He was beginning to think about them now. He found Thomas Greer near the barn and pulled his horse to a stop. "Thomas." Thomas looked up. He waited. "The south field," Nathaniel said. "Alderton tells me the drainage work came from notes that—" He stopped. Started again. "Were they Charlotte's?" Thomas held his gaze. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "She wrote those from memory, after she left." "Yes, sir." "Why would she—" He stopped himself again. He looked away toward the south field at the clean lines cut into the earth. "She didn't have to do that." "No," Thomas said. "She didn't." Why did she? Thomas considered how to answer that honestly without saying more than was his place to say. He thought about Charlotte at her kitchen table writing those pages in her careful, precise hand. He thought about what she had told him in her cottage. "I did what needed doing." "Because that's who she is," Thomas said. "It's got nothing to do with you or the estate or any obligation she still carries. That's just who she is." The words landed differently than Thomas expected. He watched something move through Nathaniel's face, not quite guilt, not quite grief, but something adjacent to both. Something that looked like a man beginning to understand the true dimensions of a loss he had chosen. "How is she?" Nathaniel asked. Thomas thought about how to answer that honestly too. He thought about Charlotte's clinic, about the women who came to her door in the early hours with frightened children, about the men who came with stubborn injuries they'd waited too long to have looked at, about the way her cottage had become, without any announcement, without any fanfare, a kind of anchor for the people within 5 miles of it. "She's better than she's been in a long time," Thomas said. "I reckon." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way he said everything, plainly as fact, with the respect of a man who didn't believe in softening truth past the point of usefulness. Nathaniel nodded. Once. The nod of a man absorbing something that hurts. He rode back to the main house and went directly to his study, and he sat down at his desk, and he did something he had almost never done in 7 years of marriage. He went looking for his wife's work, not to evaluate it, not to critique it, not to decide whether it was worthy of his attention. He went looking for it the way you go looking for something you lost, with the slowly building dread of someone who suspects they are not going to like what they find. He found the management records in the third cabinet, organized by year, by season, by category. Her handwriting throughout precise and consistent, covering page after page. Budget allocations, crop rotation schedules, notes on the conditions of specific tenant properties, records of repairs authorized, of wages dispersed, of problems identified and addressed. He found her note about the Southfield drainage, dated spring 1813. He found her records of the drought year, the payments she'd made to keep 4 families from losing their homes. He found the household accounts where she'd recorded the payments so cleanly, so quietly, that he had looked at those accounts for 2 years without ever understanding what he was looking at. He found a letter she had written to the County Road Commission about the bridge on the North Access Road, the bridge that he had always vaguely assumed was someone else's responsibility, but that she had apparently spent 8 months negotiating a repair agreement for, because without it, the eastern fields were inaccessible in wet seasons. He sat in his study for a very long time. Outside, the light changed. The morning went to afternoon. A servant knocked and asked if he wanted lunch, and he said no without looking up. He kept reading. The record of the summer of 1815. He had been away that summer in Richmond, he recalled, for 6 weeks on business that had included a significant amount of time with Victoria. He had returned to a functioning estate, to crops that had been properly managed through an unusual dry spell, to a household that had run without his involvement for 6 weeks without a single visible disruption. He had come home and thought, good. Charlotte keeps things in order. He had not asked how. He had not thought to ask. He had eaten the dinner she'd arranged, and slept in the bed she maintained, and walked the fields that she'd managed, and he had thought with genuine satisfaction, I have a good estate. Not I have a remarkable wife. Not I should understand what she does, so I can value it properly. Just good. It works. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his study. He had told her she was never his choice. He had meant it as an explanation, as an honest accounting of how their marriage had begun, as though the beginning was the whole of the story. But Charlotte had not spent 7 years in the beginning of their marriage. She had spent 7 years in the middle of it, in the daily, unglamorous, essential work of the middle, the place where love either roots itself or withers. And he had never once looked at what she was building in that middle. He had only ever looked at the surface of it. He had never seen the foundation. He picked up his pen. He sat for a long time with the pen in his hand and a blank page in front of him. He had never been good at apology. He had been raised by a father who considered apology a kind of weakness, who believed that a man's decisions spoke for themselves and required no subsequent revision. He understood sitting here now that this had been one of the more expensive things his father had taught him. He put the pen down. An apology written on paper and sent to the woman you'd dismissed as an obligation wasn't an apology. It was a performance. And he was beginning to understand, been performing things for too long. What he owed Charlotte Morgan was not a letter. He didn't know yet what it was. But it was not a letter. He closed the management records carefully with a respect he was only now learning to feel for them, and he went to find Victoria. She was in the sitting room. She looked up when he entered with the quick, assessing look she always used, reading his face the way she had always been able to read him, because Victoria Langley was not an unintelligent woman, and she had always understood Nathaniel better than he understood himself. "You went through the records," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have they been there?" 7 years, he said. "I never looked." Victoria set down her needlework. She had the careful stillness of someone who knows they are standing very close to a truth that has been avoided for a long time. "Nathaniel." "She was holding that estate together," he said. I don't mean she helped. I mean she was the foundation of it. The whole thing. The drainage, the tenants, the records, the accounts. She understood it better than I did. Better than Alderton does now. Better than my father ever did." "I know," Victoria said. He looked at her. "You know, I suspected." She held his gaze steadily. "I have always suspected. She had a quality—" Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. "A quality of seeing things." She would say something once quietly, and you would realize later that she had understood a situation completely while everyone else was still figuring out which direction to look. "I never—" "No," Victoria said, gently, precisely. "You never." The silence between them was different from the silences they usually had. Not warm, with promise. Not electric, with the particular energy of two people who believe they are each other's answer. It was a quieter silence, an honest one. "You're going to go to her," Victoria said. "I don't know if she'll see me." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "You're going to go to her," she said again, and her voice had something in it that was neither accusation nor heartbreak, but something harder to name, the sound of a woman who has somewhere in the quiet of herself always known something that she was only now allowing to be said aloud. "Victoria, she knows things about love that I don't," Victoria said. "She knows how to give it when no one is asking for it and no one is giving it back. I am not. I don't think I know how to do that." She stopped. "I think you need to learn what she knows, and I don't think you can learn it by staying here." He didn't move for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know." She picked up her needlework again. Her hands were perfectly steady. "Go." He rode to the cottage on Miller's Road in the last hour of a February afternoon when the light was thin and the cold was sharp, and the mud of the early thaw sucked at his horse's hooves with every step. He had not sent word ahead. He understood instinctively that Charlotte deserved the ability to refuse him before he arrived, not after. He didn't know what he was going to say. He wasn't sure it mattered what he said. He thought about Thomas Greer in the South Field, looking at drainage lines cut into the earth by the knowledge of a woman who had been dismissed. He thought about 4 families who still farmed this land because a woman who had no obligation to them had paid their arrears out of her own household accounts without ever saying a word about it. He thought about the bridge, the barn wall, the crop rotation records, the drought year. He thought about every morning he had come down to a functioning household and never once asked how. The cottage was ahead. There was lamplight in the window. He stopped his horse at the edge of the path. He could hear voices inside, not many, just 2. Charlotte's voice, steady and clear. A woman's voice he didn't recognize, frightened and grateful, in the way people's voices get when something has been helped that they'd stopped believing could be helped. He waited. After a while, the door opened, and a woman came out wrapped in a heavy coat carrying a small child. The child looked pale, but breathing easily. The woman clutched something to her chest, medicine, a cloth, he couldn't tell. She nodded at Nathaniel without really seeing him, the way people nod at the world when they are still inside the relief of a crisis past. He dismounted. He stood outside Charlotte's door. He raised his hand to knock, and then he stopped, because he could hear her inside moving quietly, putting things in order after whoever had just left. The small sounds of a woman in her own space, a bowl set down, water poured, a chair shifted. The sounds of a life that had been built from nothing into something in 8 miles of winter cold in 5 months without him. He stood there, and he listened. And he realized, standing outside the door of a cottage his wife had built without him, listening to the sounds of a life she'd made without him, that the question he had come here to answer was not whether Charlotte could forgive him. It was whether he had earned the right to ask. He knocked. The sounds inside stopped. A pause. Then her voice, calm and clear, the same voice that had said, "I spent 7 years waiting to be chosen," and walked out of his house and into her own life. "Come in." He reached for the door handle, and he understood in the moment before he opened it that what happened next would depend entirely on whether he had learned, finally at cost by loss, how to actually see the woman on the other side. He opened the door. Charlotte stood at the far end of the small room, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a towel in her hands, looking at him with an expression that was completely, perfectly unreadable. Not angry, not hopeful, not broken, just present, clear-eyed, entirely herself. "Nathaniel," she said. "Charlotte," he said, and then neither of them said anything at all for a moment that lasted a very long time. The lamplight was steady between them. Outside, the February wind worked at the edges of the cottage. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifted its weight in the cold. Charlotte looked at him the way she had always looked at him, seeing him fully. Seeing him in a way he was only now beginning to understand. He had never returned. "You went through the records," she said. He blinked. "How did you know?" For the first time, something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "Because you look," she said, "like a man who finally read something he should have read 7 years ago." He stood in her doorway, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him across the ballroom floor 7 years ago. Except back then, she had been looking with hope. Now she was looking with knowledge. And knowledge, Charlotte had learned, was both heavier and cleaner than hope. "You went through the records," she said. "Yes. All of them. Enough of them." She set the towel down on the table. She didn't invite him in, and she didn't turn him away. She simply waited the way she had always waited, with a patience that was not passive, but precise. The patience of a woman who understood that rushing a man toward the truth he wasn't ready for only taught him to run from it faster. "Charlotte," he said, "I need to—" "Don't say you're sorry yet," she said. He stopped. "Not because I don't want to hear it," she said, "but because you don't know yet what you're sorry for. You think you do. But you've only read the records. You haven't understood them yet." He stepped inside. He didn't ask permission. She didn't stop him. He stood in her kitchen in the small, clean, hard-won space she had built from nothing, and he looked at the shelves of medical supplies, the neat stacks of her father's journals, the 2 chairs at the table where she had clearly spent countless hours working by lamplight, and he felt the particular shame of a man who is only now seeing the full shape of his own blindness. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what I'm missing." She looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured 2 cups of tea without asking whether he wanted any, because Charlotte had always known what people needed better than they knew themselves, and right now Nathaniel Crawford needed something warm in his hands while he learned difficult things. She sat across from him, and she folded her hands on the table, and she said, "What did you find in the records?" "The Southfield drainage notes, the drought year payments, the bridge negotiation, the barn wall." He paused. 7 years of management. Detailed, careful, complete management. Of my estate. "Our estate," she said. The correction landed quietly. He felt it. "Our estate," he repeated. "What else?" He wrapped both hands around his cup. I found your note about the South Field, spring of 1813. I don't remember that spring clearly. You were in Richmond, she said. You went to Richmond in March and came back in May. The field drainage was already failing when you left. I left the note on your desk the morning before you rode out. She paused. You said you'd look at it when you returned. I didn't look at it. No. Why didn't you remind me? Charlotte tilted her head slightly. It was such an honest question, and so completely the wrong question, that for a moment she almost felt something close to tenderness for how far he still had to travel. I did remind you, she said. Twice. In May and once in July. You told me you'd handle it. You didn't. So I handled it myself, the way I always handled things myself when you forgot. I don't remember you reminding me. I know you don't. She kept her voice even. Not cold, simply true. That was the problem, Nathaniel. Not that I didn't speak. It's that you never expected me to say anything worth remembering. The silence after that was the kind that has weight. He set down his cup. He looked at his hands. He looked like a man trying to locate himself in a story he had always thought he knew and was only now discovering he had misread from the very first page. The drought year, he said. The 4 families. You paid them out of the household accounts. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I tried to, Charlotte said. I sat down with you the first week of September 1814, and I told you there were 4 tenant families who were going to default on their arrears before the month was out, and that we needed to make a decision about whether to carry them or give them notice. She paused. You were distracted. You told me to speak to the manager about it. The manager at the time was old Gerald Pitts, who was 68 years old and had been overseeing Crawford land since before you were born, and who was, God rest him, entirely incapable of making a financial decision without Nathaniel Crawford's explicit signature and authorization. She looked at him steadily. Gerald told me there was nothing he could do, so I did what needed doing. I paid the arrears. I recorded it as an estate expense because that is what it was. And I didn't bring it back to you because the crisis had been handled, and because bringing it back to you would have required me to explain that I had acted without your knowledge, which would have required a conversation about why I had acted without your knowledge, which would have required you to acknowledge that you had failed to act when I asked you to. He was very quiet. I chose the easier path, she said. I solved the problem, and I stayed quiet about how. I did that not once, Nathaniel, for years. And I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was just how things worked. She stopped. But what it actually was, what I have had 5 months of very clear-headed thinking to understand it actually was that I stopped expecting you to be my partner. And I think a part of you understood that. And I think a part of you was relieved by it. Because if I didn't expect partnership from you, you never had to deliver it. Nathaniel looked at her across the small table, and there was something happening in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not shame exactly. Something deeper than shame. Something that looked like a man standing in a room he thought he knew, and discovering the walls are made of something entirely different than what he'd assumed. Charlotte, I'm not saying this to wound you, she said. I'm saying it because you came here to understand, and I am trying for the first time in 7 years to tell you the complete truth instead of the manageable portion of it. He said nothing. Ask me the question you actually came here to ask, she said. He looked up. Not the question about the records, she said. The one underneath it. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside, the wind moved, and the cottage was solid around them. Solid because she had made it solid, because she had repaired and reinforced and maintained it with the same careful competence she had applied to everything in her life that she decided mattered. Did you love me? He said. The question came out rawer than he intended. He heard it land between them, and he watched her face, and he waited. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said. Completely. For the first 3 years. She paused. And then I loved the idea of what we could be. For 2 more years. And then... She stopped. And then I stopped being sure there was a we. I stopped being sure you were in the marriage at all, in any real sense. And I kept going because I had made promises, and because the estate needed me, and because there were people depending on what I did, the tenants, the workers, the families. She met his eyes. But I had stopped believing you saw me somewhere in the 2nd year, and by the 5th year I had stopped hoping you would start. I saw you, he said. You saw what I produced, she said. You saw the results of my work. You saw a functioning estate and an organized household and a wife who didn't make demands and didn't cause problems. You saw all the evidence of me, Nathaniel, without ever seeing me. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she let him have that moment because she understood she had always understood people's emotional processes better than they understood themselves, that he needed a moment where nobody was looking at his face. In Richmond, he said, still facing the window. The summer of 1815, when I was gone 6 weeks. Yes, I came back and the estate was everything was in order. I thought I remember thinking that you were very capable. His voice had a roughness in it. I thought it as a compliment. I thought she is capable. She manages things well. I know, Charlotte said, and I didn't think... He stopped. Started again. I didn't think about what it cost you. I didn't think about you spending 6 weeks managing a drought and the crops and the workers and the household accounts and whatever else without a partner, without anyone who understood what you were carrying, and then having your husband come home and say you were very capable. As though you were a good piece of machinery. You weren't cruel, Charlotte said. I want to be clear about that. You were never deliberately cruel to me. He turned around. I know it doesn't excuse it, she said. I'm not offering it as an excuse. I'm offering it as a fact because you look like a man who's about to start describing himself as a monster, and you weren't one. You were something more ordinary than that. She held his gaze. You were absent. You were comfortable. You had a wife who solved problems before they became problems, and a home that ran without your involvement, and it never occurred to you to ask why or how, because you had never been taught to ask those questions. You had been taught that a good estate runs well. Nobody taught you that estates don't run themselves. He walked back to the table. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands on the back of the chair, and he looked at her, and she could see him turning the truth of what she'd said over in his mind, feeling its actual dimensions, measuring it against what he had always believed about himself, about his marriage, about the life he had been living for 7 years. The night I said, he stopped. The night I told you that you were never my choice. Charlotte waited. I thought I was being honest, he said. I thought I had convinced myself that honesty was a kind of fairness, that telling you the truth about how the marriage had begun was respectful, in some way. It might have been honest, Charlotte said, but it was honest the way a man is honest when he announces the house is burning down while he's still holding the match. The truth of it doesn't make it kind. No, he said. It doesn't. And there was a larger truth you missed, she said. The marriage may have begun as your father's choice, but it had become something else in 7 years, something real. And when you stood in that room and told me I was never your choice, what you were also saying, whether you meant to or not, was that nothing we had built together mattered, that 7 years of real life between two people could be erased by the circumstances of their beginning. He sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs have decided before his mind has that he needs to be closer to the ground. I didn't understand what I was saying, he said. I know. That's not an excuse either. No, she agreed. It's not. They sat with that for a moment. 2 people and a table and a lamp and 7 years of a marriage that had been many things, not all of them bad, not all of them good, and the specific, irreversible consequence of a moment when a man had said the wrong truth in the wrong way at the wrong time, and a woman had finally stopped waiting for something better. Then Charlotte said, What did you find in the records, Nathaniel? Not the ledgers, the other records. He looked up. What other records? The correspondence drawer, she said. Bottom cabinet. The letters I wrote. He frowned. I didn't open that drawer. And here was the moment. She saw it coming before she said it, the way she always saw things coming, the way her father had taught her to see them, the full shape of a thing before it arrived. "I wrote to you," she said quietly. Not as a wife writing to a husband about household matters. "I wrote to you, as myself, as Charlotte, about what I was thinking, what I was afraid of, what I hoped for." She paused. "The first letter was in the spring of our second year. I had been feeling very alone. I couldn't say it out loud. I didn't know how. So I wrote it. I left the letter on your desk." Nathaniel was very still. "You never mentioned it," she said. "I don't remember." "There are 23 letters," Charlotte said. "One drawer, bottom cabinet. I wrote one every time I wanted to talk to you and couldn't find the words, or the moment, or the certainty that you would hear me. I left every one of them on your desk, or in your study where you would find them." She folded her hands. "You never mentioned a single one." The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had heard in a very long time. Nathaniel looked like a man who had been handed evidence of a crime he had not known he was committing. "I never read them," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know that," Charlotte said. "I assumed. But I never knew." "Charlotte." He stood up. He put both hands flat on the table, and he leaned forward, and he looked at her with the full, undivided, finally present attention that she had been looking for from him for 7 years, and she noted with a kind of quiet grief that it had taken losing her to teach him how to give it. "I am going to go back to that estate tonight. I am going to find that drawer, and I am going to read every single letter." "Nathaniel, not because it changes anything," he said quickly. "I'm not saying I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not trying to undo what I said. I know I can't undo that. I'm saying I want to know you, the way I should have known you, the way I had the chance to know you for 7 years and wasted." His voice broke slightly on the last word, just slightly, but she heard it. "Will you let me do that?" Charlotte looked at him for a long time. She thought about 23 letters sitting in a drawer unread for years. She thought about the woman who had written them, the younger Charlotte, the hopeful Charlotte, the Charlotte who had still believed that if she found the right words, the right moment, the right way of reaching. She thought about what it had cost that woman to write letter after letter and receive nothing back. Not rejection, not refusal, just silence. The particular desolation of speaking into a silence that doesn't even register your voice. She thought about what she owed that younger woman. "Yes," she said. "Read them." He nodded. He picked up his coat. He moved toward the door, and then he stopped, and he turned back, and he said something she hadn't expected. "Do you still have patients tomorrow morning?" She blinked. "Yes, I usually start seeing people at 7. Is there anything that needs doing?" "Here, with the cottage or the land. Anything practical." He said it awkwardly, with the particular clumsiness of a man trying to offer help through the only language he has reliably learned. "I could send Thomas, or Ezra's boys, if there's fencing or—" "So, the roof on the east side of the woodshed," she said, because she was nothing if not practical, and because a part of her, a small, careful, not yet trusting part, recognized that this was the only kind of offering he currently knew how to make honestly. "It needs 2 more boards before the next hard rain." He nodded. "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped. "Read all 23, she said. "Not just the easy ones." He left. She stood in her kitchen and listened to his horse move away into the dark. She stood there for a long time, long after the sound faded, long after the night settled back into its ordinary quiet. Then she sat down at her table, and she picked up her father's journal, and she wrote, not about Nathaniel, not about the estate, not about the 23 letters, or the drawer, or the south field. She wrote about a woman learning to stay still in her own life while the world rearranged itself around her. It was after midnight when she set the pen down. Nathaniel Crawford sat in his study until dawn. He found the drawer. It took him longer than it should have. He had to think about where Charlotte kept her personal correspondence, which meant He had to admit to himself that he wasn't entirely certain where she kept anything because he had never paid close enough attention to the organization of his own household to know. He found it in the bottom cabinet, exactly where she'd said. 23 letters. Each one sealed. Each one with his name on the front in her clear, careful handwriting. He opened the first one. Nathaniel, she had written in the spring of their second year. I am writing because I have tried twice this week to tell you something, and both times the moment passed before I found the words. So I am writing it instead. I am lonely. I don't say this to accuse you. I say it because I think you don't know, and I think you would want to know, and I hope that if you knew something between us might be different. I am not lonely for company. The house is full of people, and I am good at people. I am lonely for you, specifically. I am lonely for the version of you that I believed I was marrying, the man who sat with me in my father's garden the evening before our wedding and talked until midnight about what we wanted our life to look like. You were so present that night, so completely there. I have been waiting for that man to come back. I believe he is still in you somewhere. If he is, I am here. Charlotte. Nathaniel sat with that letter for a very long time. Then he opened the second one. He read all 23 before the sun came up. By the fifth letter, he understood that Charlotte had spent 2 years trying to reach him before she gave up trying and simply started doing everything herself. By the 10th letter, he understood that her apparent self-sufficiency, the thing he had always admired as capability and efficiency, was the direct result of his consistent unavailability. She had not been self-sufficient by nature. She had become self-sufficient by necessity, because asking him for partnership had produced nothing, and she was a woman who could not tolerate problems going unsolved. By the 15th letter, written in the winter of their 4th year, he understood that the loneliness she described in the first letter had transformed into something quieter and more settled. She still wrote with clarity and honesty, but the hope in the early letters had become something different. Not bitterness, more like acceptance. The acceptance of a woman who has stopped waiting for a door to open and has started building a window. By the 23rd letter, written 8 months before she left, he was barely breathing. Nathaniel, the last letter read. I don't expect you to read this. You haven't read any of them. I know that now. I kept writing anyway because writing them was the only way I knew to stay honest with myself about what I felt and what I needed and what was not being given. I want you to know, in case you ever find these, in case there is ever a version of you who looks, that I did not stop loving you because you were unlovable. You are not. You are a man with qualities worth loving. You are intelligent and capable, and when you are fully present, you are genuinely compelling. The problem was never that you were unlovable. The problem was that you were never fully present. I think you have been performing a life rather than living one. I think you have been so focused on what your life looks like, the estate, the reputation, the right wife, the right family, that you forgot to actually inhabit any of it. I was part of what your life was supposed to look like. I think that is all I was ever meant to be. I cannot keep being part of a performance. I hope you find your way to something real, with whatever is left of my love for you, Charlotte. He set the letter down on his desk. He put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a long time, not crying exactly, but something adjacent to it, something in the vicinity of grief that a man feels when he understands fully for the first time the weight of what he threw away. When he finally lifted his face, the light in the study was the thin gray of very early morning. He picked up the 23 letters and he held them carefully, the way you hold something you understand too late to be irreplaceable. And he placed them in the inside pocket of his coat close to his chest, the way a man carries something he does not intend to lose again. He found Alderton in the estate kitchen. The East Quarter drainage, Nathaniel said without preamble. Miss Morgan's notes. I want every recommendation implemented. All of them. And I want it done correctly. Alderton looked at him. That's a significant undertaking, sir. The cost? I know the cost, Nathaniel said. I've read the records. Do you understand what the estate loses every season? Those recommendations are not implemented. I'm not asking about the cost of doing this, Alderton. I'm asking about the cost of not doing it. Alderton was quiet for a moment. "Miss Morgan is thorough," he said finally. "She is," Nathaniel said. "She is far more thorough than either of us." He paused. "I want Thomas Greer brought back onto the staff, full wage with the back pay he's owed. I don't care what you have to do to convince him to come back. And the 3 families. I know about the 3 families." He had read Charlotte's notes about them too. "Make sure they understand their tenancy is secure. Make sure their agreements reflected in writing." He started to leave, then stopped. "Alderton, do you know why those families nearly left?" Alderton straightened slightly. "Wages," he said. "Wages were the symptom," Nathaniel said. "The cause was that nobody was paying attention. Nobody was watching the details. Miss Morgan watched the details for 7 years, and the estate ran well. The moment she left, we started losing things." He looked at the man squarely. "I'm not blaming you. You came to a position without knowing the whole history of the place. But I need you to understand this estate doesn't run because of good luck or good weather or good management credentials. It runs because of very specific, very detailed, very patient knowledge that was built here over years." He paused. "And we don't have the person who built it anymore, so we need to be very careful about losing anything else." He rode to Charlotte's cottage that morning with Thomas Greer beside him. He did not go inside. He stood outside with Thomas, and they fixed the east side of the woodshed roof in an hour and 40 minutes, working in near silence with the focused efficiency of men who are doing something that matters and know it. When they finished, Charlotte opened the door. She looked at the repaired roof. She looked at the 2 men. She looked at Nathaniel with the unreadable expression she had developed over 5 months of building her own life, that expression that was not warm but was not closed, that was watching and waiting, and not yet ready to be anything more than those 2 things. "Thank you," she said. "The drainage notes," Nathaniel said. "Everything you wrote, Alderton is implementing all of it." Something shifted in her face, small but real. "And the families," she said. "Settled," he said. "In writing. Thomas is back." She looked at Thomas. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. Then she looked back at Nathaniel and she said, "You read the letters." It wasn't a question. "All 23, he said. She held his gaze. She was measuring something, not whether to trust him not yet, but whether he was standing in front of her as himself or as a performance of himself. She was reading him the way she read everything carefully, thoroughly, without sentiment, overriding observation. "The last one," she said. "What did I say in the last one?" He reached inside his coat. He took the letters out. He found the last one and he held it out to her. She didn't take it. "Tell me," she said. "Don't read it. Tell me what you understood." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas had stepped back to give them distance, moving to check the horse's bridle, with the practiced discretion of a man who has worked around important conversations for 18 years. "You said I was performing a life instead of living one," Nathaniel said. "You said I was so focused on what my life looked like that I never inhabited it. You said—" He stopped. He looked at her. "You said you couldn't keep being part of a performance." "And what do you understand about that now?" she said. "I understand that you were right," he said. "I understand that I had everything, and I treated it like a backdrop. Like the things that made my life good were just scenery, the estate, the household, you." He held her gaze. "I understand that you were a person in that marriage, a full, complete, remarkable person, and I treated you like a feature of the landscape." Charlotte was very still. "I understand," he said, "that you left because you refused to spend your entire life being invisible to the one person who was supposed to see you." She looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming full now, and in it, she looked like what she was, a woman who had been through something real and come out the other side of it with her dignity, fully intact, with her intelligence and her capability and her fundamental self completely undiminished by the experience of being dismissed. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and something in his face, finally, after 7 years and 5 months and 23 unread letters, told her that he was beginning to understand it too. "Come inside," she said. She held the door open. He stepped through it, and for the first time in 7 years, Nathaniel Crawford crossed the threshold of a space that Charlotte had made entirely her own. Not a space she shared with him, not a space she maintained for him, but a space that belonged completely and only to her. And he entered it, the way a man enters a place he knows he has to earn, not by possession, but by understanding. She set water to boil. He sat down at her table. And this time, he was the one who didn't say anything first, because he was finally genuinely learning to listen. He sat at her table for the first time as a man with nothing to offer except his attention, and Charlotte, who had spent 7 years trying to earn exactly that, found she was not certain what to do with it now that it was here. She set 2 cups on the table. She sat down. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them rushed. That was new too. In 7 years of marriage, every conversation they'd had in the same room together had been colored by the feeling that Nathaniel was somewhere else in his mind, half present, half already moving toward the next thing, the next meeting, the next social obligation, the next version of his life that didn't quite include her. Now, he was simply here, in her kitchen, with his coat folded on the chair beside him and his hands wrapped around his cup, and his eyes on her face, with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has finally understood that this is the only place he needs to be. It made her deeply uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, because it was so close to what she had wanted for so long that the proximity of it made her careful. Hope, she had learned, was a thing you had to earn back slowly, the way you earn back a horse's trust after you've frightened it. You don't rush it. You don't grab for it. You stay still and you let it come to you at its own pace. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "The letters." He paused. "Why did you keep writing them if I never responded, if you knew I wasn't reading them? Why did you keep writing?" Charlotte looked down at her cup. She thought about that. It was a good question. It was the first genuinely good question he had ever asked about her interior life, and she wanted to answer it honestly. "Because writing was the only way I knew to stay honest with myself," she said. "If I stopped writing, I would have had to stop feeling. And I didn't want to stop feeling. I thought as long as I was still writing, as long as I was still putting the words somewhere, I wasn't disappearing." She paused. "There's a difference between a person who is invisible to others and a person who is invisible to herself. I refuse to be the second kind." He was quiet for a moment. "You were afraid of disappearing," he said. "I was afraid of being erased," she said. "There's a difference. Disappearing suggests you had some agency in the matter. Erasure happens to you." She looked up. "I would have come to you with things, real things, Nathaniel. Not household matters, real things. I would have told you about the books I was reading, about the problems I was thinking through, about the questions I had about the estate, and about medicine, and about us. But every time I tried, I could see in your face within 2 minutes that I had lost you. Your eyes would go somewhere else. You'd nod in a way that meant you'd stopped listening, and so I learned to compress everything I wanted to say into the shortest possible version, and then even that felt like too much. And eventually, I stopped trying to say any of it at all." She kept her voice even. "That's when I started writing, when talking stopped working." He put his cup down. He looked at her with an expression that was partly grief and partly something that looked frighteningly like recognition. "I do that," he said. "I still do that, with everyone. My eyes go somewhere else. I know. I never noticed I did it. I know that too." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Does it still happen? When I look at you now, am I?" "No," she said. And she meant it. "Right now you're here." Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like a man hearing confirmation of something he had worked very hard to achieve and was not yet certain he could maintain. "I want to stay here," he said. "I mean that in every sense. I want to. I want to be present. I understand now what it costs when I'm not. I don't want to keep paying that cost. Nathaniel. She said his name gently but firmly. I need you to understand something about where we are. He waited. You coming here and reading the letters and fixing the roof and implementing the drainage notes, those things matter. I'm not dismissing them. But they're also things you did in a week. I spent 7 years building up to the morning I left. You don't undo 7 years in a week. She held his gaze. I'm not telling you it's too late. I'm telling you that I need you to understand the actual distance between where you are and where you'd need to be. Because if you underestimate it, you'll get frustrated when it takes longer than you expect. And if you get frustrated, you'll revert. And I can't... She stopped. Her voice stayed steady, but something behind it shifted. I can't go through another version of what I already went through. I don't have it in me. I know, he said. Do you... I think... He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his next words with unusual care. I think I'm beginning to. I won't claim I understand it fully. I don't. But I understand enough to know that asking you to trust me before I've given you reason to is exactly the kind of thing I would have done before. Asking for trust without earning it. Expecting the result before doing the work. He paused. I don't want to do that again. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She was measuring him the way she measured everything, not with sentimentality, not with hope, coloring her vision, but with the clear-eyed precision of a woman who had learned at considerable cost to see things as they were, rather than as she wanted them to be. What she saw was a man who was trying, genuinely imperfectly, without the smooth performance of certainty that he usually deployed. He was trying, and he was uncertain, and he was here anyway, which was more than she had gotten from him in 7 years of marriage. It was not enough to act on, but it was something real. And real at this point was more valuable to her than perfect. Come back Thursday, she said. He blinked. Thursday. I have patience in the morning, but in the afternoon, Ezra Calloway wants to talk through the spring planting for his north field. He has questions about the soil composition on the far quarter that I think are actually related to questions about Crawford land. She paused. You should be there, not as the neighboring landowner, as someone who wants to learn how this land actually works. He was quiet for a moment. You're inviting me to a farming consultation, he said. I'm inviting you to start at the beginning, she said, where everyone who actually understands something starts. Something moved across his face, not offense, not the particular defensiveness of a man being asked to humble himself, but something softer. The look of a man who has been given an unexpected second chance and is wise enough finally to take it carefully. Thursday, he said. Bring boots, she said. The east field is still soft from the thaw. He left before noon. She stood in her kitchen after his horse's hoofbeats faded, and she pressed both palms flat on the table, and she breathed, just breathed for a long, slow moment, and she let herself feel the full complexity of what had just happened. It was not happiness. Not yet. Happiness was too simple a word for what moved through her. It was more like the feeling of ground solidifying under your feet after a long period of uncertain footing. Not safe yet. Not finished. But solid in a way it hadn't been before. She picked up her father's journal. She turned to the last entry she'd written, and she read it back to herself. A woman learning to stay still while the world rearranges itself. She had written that in the small hours of the previous night, thinking it was about patience. She read it again now. She understood it differently. It wasn't about patience. It was about having a self so firmly established that the rearranging world could not dismantle it, could not rebuild it into something else, could not ask it to become smaller or simpler or more convenient. She had that now. She had built it in 5 months of cold mornings and hard work and honest conversations with people who saw her clearly. Whatever happened with Nathaniel, whether it became something or remained exactly what it currently was, she had that. And nobody, she thought nobody was going to take it from her again. Margaret Calloway arrived that afternoon with her daughter Ruth, who had a question about a recurring rash that she'd been too embarrassed to ask the county physician about. Charlotte handled it in 20 minutes, a simple dietary sensitivity easily managed, and when Ruth left, Margaret stayed. "He came," Margaret said. "Ezra told you already." "Ezra saw his horse outside when he passed on the road." Margaret sat down and folded her hands with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been hoping for something and is now trying not to show how much she'd been hoping. "How was it?" "Complicated," Charlotte said. "Real and complicated." "Are you?" "I don't know yet," Charlotte said. "And I mean that without distress. I genuinely don't know, and I'm genuinely all right with not knowing." She paused. "He read the letters." Margaret went still. "All of them?" "All 23. "Charlotte." Margaret's voice was soft. "I know," she said. "I know." And her voice had something in it that was not sadness exactly, but adjacent to it, the particular ache of being fully seen after a very long time of invisibility. "He understood them, or he's beginning to, and that—" She stopped. "That matters. Even if nothing else comes of it, that matters." Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over Charlotte's. "You deserve someone who reads your letters," she said simply. Charlotte turned her hand over and held Margaret's for a moment. "I know that now," she said. She hadn't always known it. She had spent years believing she needed to be useful, needed to be capable, needed to be productive before she earned the right to be seen. She had believed somewhere underneath everything that love was a thing you worked for, rather than a thing you were owed by virtue of being a full human being. She was done believing that. Thursday came with thin sunshine and soft mud, exactly as Charlotte had predicted. Nathaniel arrived at the Calloway farm at the precise hour she'd told him. She noticed that. He had been late to every social engagement, every estate meeting, every dinner she had ever organized. He was not late now. He was wearing different boots. Work boots, not riding boots. He had listened to that too. Ezra Calloway looked at him with the careful assessment of a man who has heard about someone for a long time and is now deciding what he thinks of them in person. He shook Nathaniel's hand without particular warmth, but without hostility, which Charlotte understood was the exact right register for where they all were. "Miss Morgan says you want to understand the land," Ezra said. "I want to start understanding it," Nathaniel said. "There's a difference." Ezra glanced at Charlotte. Something brief passed between them, the quick small language of people who have spent months working alongside each other. "Good answer," Ezra said. They walked the north field together. Ezra talked, Charlotte clarified, and Nathaniel listened, not with the polite performative listening Charlotte remembered from estate meetings where he would nod at intervals and his eyes would drift to the window. He listened with his whole body facing the speaker with questions that showed he had actually absorbed what was said before asking what came next with the willingness to admit what he didn't know that Charlotte had never once seen from him in 7 years of marriage. It was disorienting to watch. She kept expecting him to revert, kept waiting for the moment his attention slid away for the familiar glazing of the eyes, the slight turn of the shoulder that meant he had mentally already left the room. It didn't come. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun moved. The mud on the east quarter sucked at their boots. Nathaniel's coat got a long stripe of brown from where he steadied himself against a fence post on a slippery patch and didn't quite manage it. He looked at the mud on his coat and he laughed. Actually laughed, not the polished social laugh she was accustomed to. Not the performance of amusement, but a genuine, slightly self-deprecating laugh at his own ungainliness. And Charlotte, who was standing 3 feet away, felt something inside her shift that she hadn't been expecting. She made herself look at the field instead. On the walk back to Calloway's house, Ezra fell slightly behind to check the fence line, and Charlotte and Nathaniel walked ahead in a silence that was different from the careful silences of the previous days. Less loaded, more ordinary. "The clay layer," Nathaniel said, "on the east quarter of our south field. You identified it in 1813. I walked that field the first summer we were married," Charlotte said. "I wanted to understand what we had, what the land could do." She paused. "I kept a journal about it, not the management records, a separate one. Notes about the soil, the drainage patterns, the way different areas responded to wet seasons and dry ones. Do you still have it? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I would like to read it someday, if you'd be willing. She looked at him sideways. That's the third time this week you've asked permission for something, she said. I'm aware. You never used to ask permission. I know. He looked at her. I never used to understand that I needed to. They walked for a few more steps. It's a significant change, she said. I'm a man who spent 40 years not changing, he said. I reckon I've got some catching up to do. The word reckon was so entirely unlike the polished, formal Nathaniel Crawford she had been married to that she stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him. What? He said. Nothing, she said. You just sounded like yourself. He frowned slightly. What do I usually sound like? Like someone performing the role of Nathaniel Crawford, she said. Plantation owner, Virginia gentleman, man of standing. She started walking again. Just now you sounded like a person. He was quiet for the rest of the walk, but she could tell the way she could always tell things about people that he was turning it over, feeling the shape of it, taking it seriously. She was beginning to understand that this was what changed people. Not grand revelations, not single moments of dramatic insight. It was this, the small, persistent, repeated choosing of something different. Again and again in mud-covered boots, asking permission, listening with your whole body, noticing when you sounded like yourself, and staying with the discomfort of what that revealed. It was slow, unglamorous work. It was the only kind that lasted. She found out about Victoria 3 days later. Not from Nathaniel, from Mrs. Hargrove, who had many failings, but not the failing of letting important information go undelivered to the people who needed it. Miss Morgan. Mrs. Hargrove said, catching Charlotte outside the general store on a Tuesday morning, with the practiced precision of a woman who had been waiting for this exact opportunity. I wonder if you've heard. Charlotte had learned long ago that Mrs. Hargrove's "I wonder if you've heard" was the social equivalent of a cannon being loaded. I reckon I haven't, she said, because she had been spending time with Ezra Calloway, and the word reckon was apparently contagious. Miss Langley has left the county, Mrs. Hargrove said. Charlotte went still. She departed last Saturday. Mrs. Hargrove continued with the careful, slightly performative regret of a woman delivering news she finds interesting. Went to her sister's family in Maryland. I understand there was a parting of ways with Mr. Crawford. A pause loaded with implication. Some say she left rather suddenly. Charlotte kept her expression neutral. I see, she said. There are those who say, Mrs. Hargrove pressed on, that Mr. Crawford ended things, that he had come to certain realizations. Another pause. About the importance of... She seemed to be searching for the precise, maximally interesting word, permanence. Charlotte looked at the woman steadily. Mrs. Hargrove, she said, I appreciate you thinking of me, but whatever Mr. Crawford does or doesn't do in his personal life is his own matter. Of course, Mrs. Hargrove said, looking deeply unconvinced. Charlotte went home. She stood in her kitchen, and she thought about Victoria Langley packing her things and leaving on a Saturday going to Maryland, going away. She felt an unexpected wave of something, not triumph. She checked for triumph first, because she wanted to be honest with herself about it. Not triumph, but something closer to sadness for a woman who had probably also been looking for something real and had also not quite found it. She thought about what she had said to Victoria in January outside the general store. He is a man who doesn't see what's right in front of him until it's gone. She wondered if Victoria had believed her at the time. She wondered if Victoria believed her now. Nathaniel came Thursday as he had been coming every Thursday. He arrived at the Calloway farm, and he worked the morning with Ezra, and he did not mention Victoria at all. Charlotte waited until the end of the morning. Victoria left, she said. He stopped. Mrs. Hargrove told me Tuesday, Charlotte said. Maryland. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. Not guilty, not relieved, something more complex. I should have told you myself, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. I ended it in February, he said. The week after I found the letters. I didn't. He paused. I didn't want you to think that anything I was doing here was because I was free to do it. I needed you to know that what happened between Victoria and me ended before I started trying to understand anything. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid it would look calculated, he said. I was afraid you'd think I'd ended things with her in order to pursue something with you, and I didn't want to. He stopped. He looked at her with the direct, unglamorous honesty she was beginning to trust. I didn't want to pressure you. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something, because I'd made a choice. I wanted whatever happened between us to be entirely your decision, made with no obligation. Charlotte was very quiet for a moment. That, she said slowly, is the most considerate thing you have ever said to me. I'm trying, he said. I know you are. Is it? He stopped himself. She watched him consciously prevent himself from asking what she thought of it, from seeking the reassurance he was used to seeking. He swallowed. He looked at the ground. All right, he said instead. Never mind. Nathaniel. He looked up. You can ask, she said gently. You're allowed to need things from people. You're just not allowed to demand them. He let out a slow breath. Something in his shoulders changed. I don't want you to feel pressured, is what I'm asking. I don't, she said. What I feel is cautious and clear-eyed, and... She paused because the next word surprised her a little when she found it. Curious? Curious, he repeated. About who you're becoming, she said. I spent 7 years with who you were. I don't know yet who you're becoming. And I find I'm curious about it. He looked at her with an expression that was wholly unperformed and therefore wholly real. That's enough for me, he said. For now, that's more than I deserve. Don't do that, she said sharply. He blinked. Don't tell me it's more than you deserve, she said. That's a different kind of performance. The performance of a man being humble about his failings. I need you to actually be different, not to narrate yourself being different. She held his gaze. When you start talking about what you deserve, you make it about you. And right now it needs to be about the work. He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, You are the most exacting person I have ever met. Yes, she said. I am. I have always been. She turned toward the field. Come on. Ezra wants to look at the drainage ditch on the north end before the afternoon rains. He fell into step beside her. Charlotte, he said. Thank you. For what specifically? For... He thought about it. For not making it easy. For not telling me what I wanted to hear. For being exactly this exacting. He paused. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who told me what I wanted to hear. I think it's part of why I never learned to see things clearly. Charlotte kept walking. She kept her face forward. She did not let him see the small, involuntary thing that happened around her eyes when he said that the thing that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. You're welcome, she said. Now watch your step. The mud's deeper here. The weeks that followed had a shape to them. Not dramatic. Not the shape of a love story with sweeping gestures and grand declarations, but something quieter and more sturdy. Nathaniel came on Thursdays. Sometimes he came other days too, to work with Thomas Greer, to sit with Ezra Calloway and learn the language of soil and weather and the complicated patience of growing things. He read Charlotte's land journal carefully without annotation, and when he returned it to her, he asked 3 specific questions about the clay layer notation that told her he had understood what he was reading. She began to teach him, not about the estate or not only about the estate. She began to teach him the thing underneath the estate management, the particular quality of attention that made it possible to understand a place. The ability to observe without agenda. To watch a field and ask what it needed rather than what it would produce. To listen to a person, a worker, a tenant, a frightened woman with a sick child, and hear what they were saying underneath what they were saying. It was the most fundamental skill she had. She had never tried to teach it to anyone before. She found to her own surprise that he was a better student than she had expected. Not effortlessly, he stumbled. He defaulted sometimes to the managing, directing energy of a man accustomed to authority. He would start to give instructions when the situation called for questions, and she would say quietly, "What are you doing?" And he would stop and recalibrate. He was learning slowly to catch himself before she had to catch him. That was progress. Real progress. The kind that couldn't be faked. One morning in late April, a woman named Clara Renner came to the cottage just after 7. Charlotte knew Clara. She'd treated her 2 children through a difficult winter, and she knew from the way Clara stood in the doorway, not quite entering, that this was something different. Nathaniel was at the table, having arrived early that day, with a question about the spring planting. Charlotte looked at him, and he understood immediately, without being told, and stood up. "I'll wait outside," he said. Clara's shoulders dropped half an inch with relief. He went outside. He sat on the step. He waited for an hour and a half while Charlotte talked with Clara, while Clara cried and stopped and started again, while the crisis inside the cottage worked itself through the particular stages of a woman trying to decide whether to name a thing she had been living with for a long time. Charlotte worked through it with her carefully and completely, and when Clara left, she looked steadier than when she'd arrived. Not fixed, but not alone. Nathaniel came back inside. He didn't ask what it had been about. He looked at Charlotte's face and he said, "What do you need right now?" She looked at him. It was again the right question. The question of a man who had learned that his job in this moment was not to understand everything that had happened, or to be relevant to it, or to be needed, but simply to be present to the person in front of him. "Tea," she said, "and quiet." He put water on. He sat across from her. He was quiet. And Charlotte Morgan, sitting in the kitchen of the cottage she had built with her own hands and her own knowledge and her own fierce refusal to disappear, Charlotte Morgan felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not love. Not yet. Not the name-declared committed thing. But the precondition of it. The soil in which it could, if tended correctly, begin to grow. She looked at him across the table. This man who had failed her so completely, and was now with such deliberate, unglamorous effort, trying to become someone who wouldn't. And she thought, I was never waiting to be chosen. I was waiting to be seen. He reached across the table and set the teacup in front of her, without flourish, without declaration. She wrapped both hands around it. Outside, the spring morning was beginning to warm. Spring moved into summer the way truth moves into a person, gradually, then all at once. By May, Nathaniel Crawford had become a familiar presence at the Callaway farm on Miller's Road, and in the lives of the people Charlotte had built her new world around. He did not announce this presence. He did not make it a declaration. He simply showed up again and again in the unglamorous places, the muddy fields, the early mornings, the moments when there was work to be done and no audience to perform for, and he did what needed doing without being asked. Thomas Greer noticed first, as Thomas noticed most things. He told Ezra one morning, leaning on a fence post while they watched Nathaniel work a drainage channel with 2 of the farmhands, "He's different." Ezra said, "In what way?" Thomas said, "He stopped pretending to already know things." Ezra watched Nathaniel for a moment, watched him ask one of the farmhands to show him the correct angle for the spade, watched him actually listen to the answer, watched him adjust without embarrassment, and he said, "Yeah, I see it." Charlotte saw it too. She watched it the way she watched everything carefully, without letting herself want it too much, without letting hope outrun evidence. She had been burned by hope outrunning evidence before. She was not going to let that happen again. So she watched. She measured. She noted the days he showed up against the days he didn't, and she noted that the ratio was so consistently in favor of showing up that it stopped being remarkable and started being simply true. He was there. He kept being there. That was the thing about real change she had come to understand. It didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a speech or a gesture or a moment of dramatic transformation. It arrived quietly in the accumulation of small days, each one a little more honest than the last. The test came in June, and she hadn't planned it, and neither had he. And that was exactly why it mattered. She had a difficult case. A man named Robert Finch, 40 years old, a farmer from the far side of the county, who had been brought to her cottage by his wife and his brother after 3 weeks of a worsening condition that the county physician had failed to properly identify. Charlotte identified it within the first examination, a systemic infection that had been treated as a simple fever, allowed to progress much further than it should have, and she understood immediately that what she was dealing with was serious, and that she was going to need to make decisions that were above the usual quiet scope of her cottage practice. She worked for 6 hours straight. Robert Finch's wife sat in the corner of the room and did not speak and did not leave. Charlotte's hands were steady throughout. Her mind was the clear, focused, unfrightened thing it always was in crisis, her father's training holding, as it always held exactly when she needed it. Nathaniel arrived in the middle of it. He stood in the doorway, read the room in 1 second, and did not say a word. He went to the kitchen. He put water to boil. He kept it boiling quietly, replenishing it when needed for 4 hours. He went outside and unsaddled his horse and fed it without being asked, because he understood without being told that this was going to take longer than a morning. He came back inside and sat with Robert Finch's wife, a woman he had never met from a family with no connection to Crawford Estate, and he talked to her. Quietly, steadily, about nothing important about her farm and her children and the spring planting, about everything except the man in the next room who might or might not come through the night. He kept her from drowning in the waiting. Charlotte heard his voice through the wall as she worked, low and steady, unhurried, present. Robert Finch survived. It was near midnight when the crisis broke, and the fever began to drop, and Charlotte came out of the back room with her sleeves still rolled and her hair entirely undone, and her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, from the release of 6 hours of controlled precision, and found Nathaniel sitting at her kitchen table with Robert Finch's wife, 2 empty teacups between them, the woman asleep in her chair, and Nathaniel watching her sleep with the careful attention of a man who has appointed himself a guardian and takes the appointment seriously. He looked up when Charlotte came in. His eyes went to her hands. He saw the shaking. He stood up immediately, and he took both her hands in his, not gently but firmly, the grip of someone steadying a person who has just come through something that cost them, and he said low enough not to wake the sleeping woman, "Is he all right?" "He'll live," she said. He held her hands for a moment longer than strictly necessary. She let him. Then she stepped back and she said, "There's tea left. I'll make fresh," he said. And he did. They sat at her table in the quiet of the late night, while Robert Finch's wife slept in her chair, and the lamp burned low between them, and Charlotte drank her tea, and slowly, gradually came back to herself, the way you come back from very cold water, all at once, then a little more, then a little more. "You stayed," she said. "Of course I stayed." "You didn't know how long it would take." "Didn't matter," he said. She looked at him across the lamp. "Nathaniel," she said, "what are we doing?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitant quiet of a man avoiding the question, but the considered quiet of a man who wants to answer it honestly. "I think," he said, "we're doing something that doesn't have an easy name yet, and I think—" He paused. "I think I'm all right with that. For the first time in my life, I'm all right with doing something that doesn't have a name yet, with letting it be what it is before I decide what to call it." She looked at him. "That's growth," she said. "Don't tell me that," he said. "I'll get complacent." She almost smiled. Almost. She set her cup down. She looked at her own hands, steadier now. She thought about the woman who had written 23 letters to a man who never read them. She thought about what it had taken to become someone who no longer needed to write letters to be heard. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I have been offered a position," she said. "Dr. Emmett Hale in Charlottesville. He's an old friend of my father's. He wrote to me in March. He's expanding his practice and he wants a partner." She kept her voice even. "A real partner. Someone who handles the full range of cases alongside him, not as an assistant. As a physician in every practical sense of the word, regardless of what the formal title would have to be called for the sake of convention." Nathaniel said nothing. It's a significant opportunity, she said. It's what my father trained me for. It's... She paused. It is the version of my life that would have seemed impossible when I was Mrs. Nathaniel Crawford. It is entirely possible now. He was very still. She watched his face go through something complicated in private. She watched him encounter the information and feel the impact of it and begin visibly to make choices about how to respond. She could see him choosing. That was new too. The old Nathaniel would have reacted. This one was choosing. When would you need to decide? He asked. I told Dr. Hale I'd give him an answer by July. That's 4 weeks. Yes. He looked at her. Are you telling me this because you've already decided and you're telling me as a courtesy? Or are you telling me because it's a factor in the decision? It was exactly the right question. The precise right question. The question of a man who has learned to check his own assumptions before acting on them. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Charlotte, he said, I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to hear it without reading obligation into it or pressure, or any kind of claim. Say it, she said. If that position is what you want, if that is the life that makes use of everything you are, then take it. He looked up. His eyes were steady. Don't factor me into that decision as a reason not to take something that's yours. I spent 7 years being the thing that held you back without knowing that's what I was doing. I will not spend one more day of your life in that role. He paused. Whatever happens between us, whatever this is, it does not get to cost you that. I won't allow it. Charlotte looked at him. She looked at him for a long, slow, measuring moment. And something inside her, something she had been holding carefully in both hands for months, not clutching it, not letting it go, just holding it carefully, shifted. Not opened entirely, but shifted. You understand, she said quietly, that saying that is exactly why I'm thinking about not going. Something moved across his face, raw and real and completely unguarded. I know, he said, and I understand the irony of it, believe me. She stood up from the table. She went to check on Robert Finch. She came back and said, He's sleeping well. His wife should be here when he wakes. Will you? I'll stay until morning, Nathaniel said. Go sleep. You've earned it. She stopped in the doorway to the back room. She looked at him, this man sitting at her kitchen table in the small hours-appointed guardian, to 2 people he didn't know. Asking nothing, offering simply his presence and his steadiness and his finally genuinely given attention. Nathaniel, she said. Sleep in the chair. Don't let yourself get stiff on the floor. A pause. Yes, ma'am, he said. The ma'am in his voice was not formal. It was warm and faintly amused, and entirely natural, and it sounded so unlike every performance of Nathaniel Crawford she had ever witnessed, and so entirely like the person underneath all those performances that Charlotte had to turn away before he saw what it did to her face. She slept 4 hours. When she woke, the early light was coming through the small window and the cottage was quiet. She heard voices from the kitchen low. Careful, the voices of people trying not to disturb. And she went out and found Robert Finch, sitting upright in a chair. Pale but present, his wife beside him, holding his hand, and Nathaniel across from them, talking about drainage of all things, about the spring planting and the soil conditions. And Robert Finch was listening with the careful attention of a sick man who finds that practical conversation about the world is a better medicine than sympathy. Charlotte stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Nathaniel saw her. He said to Robert Finch, "Excuse me." And he stood up and crossed the room, and he said quietly close to her ear, "He woke at 4. Wife woke 10 minutes later. He's been asking questions about farming since 5. I believe he's going to be fine." She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the sleeplessness in his face, the mild discomfort of a night in a chair, the particular rumpled quality of a man who has been present all night without preparation. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me," he said. "This is what people do for each other." She held his gaze. "I know that," she said. "But you didn't used to." He was quiet. "That's not a wound," she said. "I'm not saying it to wound you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the fact that you do now, the fact that this is who you've become, that matters. I want you to know that I see it." Something happened in his eyes. Something that was not about the estate, or the records, or the letters, or any of the practical machinery of what they'd been rebuilding together. Something simpler. The look of a person being seen fully accurately, without flattery, and knowing it. She understood that look. She knew it from the inside. Robert Finch and his wife left by mid-morning. His wife held Charlotte's hand for a long moment at the door and said, "I don't know what we would have done." And Charlotte said, "You would have managed. People do." After they left, the cottage was quiet, with the particular quiet of a space that has held something serious, and now holds only the aftermath. Nathaniel was sitting on the step outside. Charlotte came and sat beside him. They sat in the late morning sun, or rather in the warmth of it, because Charlotte was never someone who needed to describe what surrounded her, only what moved through her, and they were quiet together. In a way, they had never been quiet together in 7 years of marriage. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say to each other. The silence of two people who have enough to say that they can afford to let it wait. He spoke first. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know, before I ask it, that the answer, whatever the answer is, doesn't change what I've been doing these past months. It doesn't change what I intend to keep doing. I'm not asking in order to get something. I'm asking because I need to be honest with you, and being honest with you means telling you what I actually want." She waited. "I want you to come home," he said. Quiet. "Not to Crawford Estate," he said. "I know what that place represents, and I know you built your own home, and I would never ask you to give that up. I mean..." He stopped. He started again. I want us to build something together, properly, as partners, the way we should have built it from the beginning." He looked at her. "I know I'm asking you to trust something that failed before. I know that's the most difficult thing I could ask. I know I don't have the right to ask it without acknowledging how completely I failed to earn it the first time." "You're asking anyway," she said. "I'm asking anyway," he said, "because I'm done performing a life. You told me that's what I was doing, and you were right, and I'm done with it. And the life I actually want, not the performance, the real thing, has you in it." He paused. "I know that's not enough by itself. I know wanting something doesn't make you deserve it, but I wanted to say it, plainly, without dressing it up." Charlotte looked out at the land she had spent 6 months tending. The garden she'd put in along the south side of the cottage. The drainage ditch Ezra's sons had helped her dig. The woodshed with the repaired roof. She had built all of this. She had built it to prove to herself that she could, that she didn't need Crawford Estate, or Nathaniel Crawford, or anyone else, to have a life that was wholly, completely, undeniably hers. She had proved it. She knew it. In her bones, in her hands, in the steadiness of her own voice, when she told people difficult truths. She knew it. And knowing it, being completely, absolutely certain of it, was the only reason she could consider what he was asking without losing herself in the considering. She turned to look at him. "I'm not coming back as your wife," she said. He stayed very still. "I am not going to be Mrs. Nathaniel Crawford again," she said. "That woman, the one who managed your estate invisibly, and wrote 23 letters that went unread and compressed everything she felt into the shortest possible version, she's gone. She's not coming back, and you do not get to ask her to." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't." "But Charlotte Morgan," she said, "the physician, the woman who fixed Silas Webb's field and talked to Clara Renner and kept Robert Finch alive last night, the woman who knows this land better than anyone in this county." She held his gaze. "That woman, if she came to Crawford Estate, it would be as herself, fully. With her own work, her own income, her own decisions. No more invisible management, no more silent fixing. If something needs to be said, it gets said. If something needs to be heard, it gets heard." She paused. "If that's what you're asking for that woman on those terms, then that is a different conversation." Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been learning slowly to look at things, with his full attention, without agenda, without the rush to understand that prevents actual understanding. "That is what I'm asking for," he said. "Say it back to me," she said. "Not as confirmation. Say what you understand it to mean." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said, "that you are not coming back to disappear into my life. You're coming, if you come to build something together, that is as much yours as it is mine. I understand that your work is not a hobby or a kindness. It is who you are, and it goes with you wherever you go. I understand that when you speak, I listen. Not nod. Listen." He paused. "I understand that I have to earn this every single day, and that there is no point at which I get to stop earning it. I don't get to do the work until you come back and then stop doing it. The work is the relationship." He looked at her steadily. "And I understand that if I stop doing the work, you will leave, again, and that you will be right to." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Dr. Hale's offer." "If you want to take it," he said immediately. "Take it. Charlottesville is 2 days' ride. We'd figure it out." "I don't want to take it," she said. He went still. "I want to build something here," she said. "I want to expand the clinic. I want to work with Dr. Alderman in the county. He's a decent physician, but he's overwhelmed and he knows it. I want to formalize what I've been doing, give it proper standing, make it something that can continue." She paused. "I want to do that from here, because this is where the people are who need it. This is where I know the land and the families and the history." She met his eyes. "And because this is where you are." He didn't say anything. She watched him absorb it, watched him take it in, without rushing to respond, without filling the space with words, before he'd actually felt what she'd given him. She watched him sit with it. That was the change, right there. That was the thing she had needed to see, and she was seeing it. "Charlotte," he said finally. "Would you let me choose you now?" he said. "Properly. Knowing who you are. Knowing what I'm choosing." She looked at him. She thought about this ballroom, the ring on the table, the walk through the wet grass in the dark. She thought about 23 letters in a drawer. She thought about 6 months of early mornings and hard work, and the slow, unglamorous building of a self that belonged entirely to her. She thought about a man sitting in a chair all night for strangers, and asking what she needed before he asked what had happened, and saying, "Take it," without hesitation, when she told him about Charlottesville. "Only if you understand something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was never waiting to be chosen," she said. "I was waiting to be respected. Chosen is what you do in a ballroom when you pick the most suitable woman. Respected is what you do every morning when you show up and tell the truth and do the work." She held his gaze. "Can you do that? Not promise to do it? Do it." "I've been doing it since February," he said. "I know," she said. "Then is the answer yes," he said. And for the first time there was something young in his voice, something stripped of the Crawford dignity and the Virginia gentleman and all the performance, just a man asking a woman if she will let him stay. She looked at the land she had built. She looked at the man beside her, who had finally learned to see it. "The clinic stays," she said. "On Miller's Road, exactly where it is. My patients come first on the days they need me." "Understood," he said. "Thomas Greer gets formal recognition as head groundsman with wages to match. In writing." "Already done," he said. She looked at him. "When March," he said. "When I brought him back." She absorbed that, quietly, let it land where it belonged. "The management records," she said. "Joint. Every decision about this land gets made jointly or not at all." "Yes," he said. "And if you ever stop listening to me," she said, "I won't write you a letter. I'll tell you directly, to your face, and you'll hear it." "I'll hear it," he said. The morning was fully warm now. Somewhere down the road she could hear Ezra's oldest boy calling to the others about something, some ordinary urgency of farm life. And the sound of it was dear to her in a way she hadn't expected when she'd first arrived here in the dark with her travel case and her father's journal, and nothing else. She had not lost anything by leaving Crawford Estate. She had found everything. Yes, she said. His breath changed. Yes, she said again, steadier. To being partners, to building something real, to the work. She paused. Not to disappearing, not to being an obligation, not to making myself small so you don't have to grow. Never again, he said. Then yes. He reached out and took her hand. Not the way he had placed the wedding ring on her finger 7 years ago, with ceremony, with the performance of meaning. He took her hand, the way you take hold of something you understand, you almost lost, with the quiet, fierce gratitude of a man who has learned at full cost what it is worth. She held on. She did not let go first. When Thomas Greer heard the news, he said nothing. He nodded once, the way he nodded at things that were simply right. Margaret Calloway cried briefly at her kitchen table, and then recovered herself and said she'd been expecting it since February. Ezra Calloway shook Nathaniel's hand and said, "You'd better be worth her time." And Nathaniel said, "I intend to keep working on it." And Ezra said, "Good answer," again. The clinic on Miller's Road stayed exactly where it was. Charlotte expanded it in September with the help of 3 men from the county and a donation of materials from Crawford Estate that Nathaniel had offered without negotiation, without attaching his name to it publicly, without making it a gesture anyone was meant to admire. She found out about the donation from Thomas, not from Nathaniel, and when she asked him about it, he said, "The clinic does more good for this county than anything I've built in 20 years. It made sense to help it." She looked at him for a moment. "You're getting better at this," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "I know," she said. Crawford Estate recovered that year, not because Nathaniel Crawford had suddenly become a brilliant land manager, but because for the first time in its history, the people who actually understood it were being listened to. Thomas Greer worked the land the way he'd always known it needed to be worked. The drainage systems Charlotte had mapped and planned were finally fully implemented. The tenant families, the ones who'd nearly left the ones Charlotte had quietly kept through the drought year and the hard winters they stayed. They worked. They prospered. Nathaniel sat with Charlotte on the steps of her clinic on a Tuesday evening in October, when the air had gone the particular gold and sharp of a Virginia autumn, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "You always want to ask something," she said without heat. "The first letter," he said. "The one from the spring of our 2nd year." He paused. "You said you were lonely for me. You said you believed I was still in there somewhere, and you were waiting for me to come back." He looked at her. "I want you to know that the man you were waiting for, the one from your father's garden the night before the wedding, the one who talked with you until midnight, I don't think he ever left. I think he was just buried, under all the performance, all the expectation." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you were the only person who ever believed he was still there." Charlotte looked at him. "I know," she said softly. "Thank you for believing that," he said, "even when I gave you no reason to." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I did it for myself, because I needed to believe that the man I had married was real, that what I had felt was real." She paused. "It turned out he was. It just took losing everything for him to figure that out too." He didn't say anything. She looked out at the land she knew better than anyone alive. The land she had spent 8 years learning in different ways through different seasons, with different eyes. "Nathaniel," she said. "You're here," she said. "You're actually here." He took her hand. "I know," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." And she believed him, not because he promised it, not because it would have been too painful not to believe him, but because she had watched him prove it day after day in the small and unglamorous and completely real language of a man who had finally fully learned the difference between owning something and being grateful for it. She had spent 7 years waiting to be chosen. She had spent 6 months learning she didn't need to be. And in the end, the most remarkable thing was not that Nathaniel Crawford had changed. It was that Charlotte Morgan had never needed him to, because she had already chosen herself, and everything that came after was simply the world catching up to what she had always known she deserved.